So at max, every 3 to 4 years, you might be able to get a 15% increase internally. But if you want to really bump that up and start, increasing your salary by 20 to 30%, that's when you have to make a move from one company to the other.
Welcome to the Networking with Michelle podcast, the show dedicated to providing you with life strategies with a little bit of entrepreneur advice. Here we believe in the Jim Rohn quote, success is nothing more than a few simple disciplines practiced every day. Hey everyone, welcome to the Networking with Michelle show. I'm your host, Michelle Gomez, where we discuss life strategies with a bit of entrepreneurial advice. And today, I have a special treat for y'all. I'm actually interviewing my mentor, Mr. Darrell James, and I met Darrell 2013-14 through the National Black NBA Houston chapter. He was the president. I was the corresponding secretary, and we've been rocking ever since. And just a great guy, great family guy, business guy. And today we're going to talk about personal branding in the corporate space. And I think this is very important because, and it could just be the space that I'm in, trying to, getting the business off the ground. And there's a lot of emphasis on personal branding. And when it gets to the monetizing part, it's, selling consultation services, speaking, and all that kind of stuff. But it's very rare, and I could be wrong, but it's very rare to see someone that talks about personal branding solely in the corporate space. And it's mentioned and there's tips on that, but it's like, how do you create and leverage your personal brand in order for you to get the promotions and the money that you deserve? And Darrell is a corporate recruiter or executive recruiter. And so we dive into that topic. And what I love about his progression is, this worked for him, right? Before we were calling it personal branding, it's all it is your reputation, right? Your reputation, your resume and your network all tied into one personal brand, really. And, he takes us through his career as well as how he was able to leverage his network and opportunities and eventually start his own company, James and Jordan, and the author of Inclusion Recruiting. So I'm going to have all of that in the show notes for you to check out, of course. Without further ado, Mr. Darrell James. All right, everyone. I have Darrell James on the show. How are you doing today, Darrell?
I am doing good, Michelle. How about yourself?
Good. So glad to finally get you on.
My pleasure.
This is, believe it or not, you are the episode for the 3-year anniversary.
Oh, okay. I'm glad to hear that. There's nothing better than, celebrating the anniversary. So congratulations on 3 years.
Thank you. So I've had the pleasure of working alongside you at the Black NBA, 2013, 2014. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I don't know. I was like, we go back, right? 3, 4, 5 years, we go back now. But why don't you tell the listeners what you do?
What do I do? I am in the headhunting business. And I say that because that's typically how people identify me. But I'm in the executive search business where I help various corporate clients identify talent. And typically that talent is going to be anyone from a senior individual contributor to someone who's kind of at that executive level, that VP level, director VP level type of position. Typically, the areas of specialty are going to be either in engineering, sales, or IT, as well as HR. So those are our typical areas of focus.
And when you say executive search, is that based off a title, years of experience? How do you define executive?
And different people have different definitions. So let me say that first. But typically, I define executive someone who's going to be, kind of to what I just said, that senior level individual contributor to someone who's at that VP level. And the reason I do that is because as a small business owner, it's hard for me to compete with the global executive search firms where they're doing only things at the C-suite and board type of positions. But I believe when I first started my business that there was this huge gap between, that person, that 10 to 15 year person and that VP level. And depending on the industry, depending on the job, you could have someone who's managing 20 people and they're making $150,000 a year. But you also have that person who has no management responsibility and they're just doing their job and they're making $150,000 a year. So that's kind of how I created that box as it relates to the title of executive search.
And what were you doing before your business?
Before my business, I have a corporate HR background. So been in the, going back to the early 90s, started work with Arizona State University. Last position I had there, I was the director of minority engineering programs. From there, went into Motorola Semiconductors in Phoenix, Arizona. With Motorola, moved to Austin, Texas. That's when I got married. And I was an HR manager there in Austin, left Austin, came to Houston. And that's when I came and started working for Deloitte. I was the director of HR for their Gulf Coast cluster. That's what they called it at the time. From Deloitte, I went to the Houston Rockets. I was director of HR for the Houston Rockets. I was an HR manager and recruiter for Nokia, which is really was a kind of a contract gig, but it was like a 2-year contract gig. Mm-hmm. And then from there, worked with an executive search firm by the name of the Hudson Highland Group. And then that's where I really got my feet wet in the executive search business. And that's when I said, okay, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. And at that point, I decided that's going to be my ship. But I had to decide, do I want to do it from an entrepreneurial standpoint or do I want to do it with another large firm? And I chose to go the entrepreneurial route.
So when you look back at your career with the corporations, were you recruited for some of those positions or were you actively applying for jobs?
Let's see.
For some of them.
To be quite honest with you, I was for the most part recruited. When I left Arizona State to go to Motorola, I was truly recruited because I was perfectly content at Arizona State. I kind of had this track of working in academia. I had started the first semester of a PhD program. So I was set to be in academia, probably more on the administrative side versus the tenured professor side. But when Motorola called and they started waving some dollars at me, and they said, you can travel too. I was like, what? and then I really wanted to try that corporate scene. And the first 6 months was a tough adjustment. But once I made that adjustment, it was kind of the sky's the limit from there.
So you were developing a personal brand before it's called personal brand. If you were getting
absolutely.
If you were being recruited from some of those organizations.
And that's how developing that personal brand, that's actually how I got those different jobs. And it was through the relationships that I was able to create. Some of those relationships were people that I was working with. Some of those relationships were other people. And so there is something to be said about the power of not just networking, but building strategic relationships. And that's probably been the biggest, one of the largest things that I've learned that I still seek out today. And so that's what I owe to my success, was building those relationships, having good mentors, and actually in some cases having good sponsors. And there's a big difference between the two.
Break it down.
A mentor is someone that you can go to who's going to help you, advise you. Sometimes that could be your hiring manager. Sometimes that could be someone who's outside of the company. They could be in another department. It could be an uncle. It could be your parents. So a mentor can be anybody, but a sponsor, that's the one. The sponsor is someone who typically is in who's within your chain of command, but typically they're going to be someone who's probably going to be a level above you. or I'm sorry, 2 levels above you, 2 to 3 levels above you, and they notice that you have talent. They like who you are, and they make sure that certain things happen within your career. They advise you on things on your career, and that's when my career really took off. When I had that sponsor, and it was actually that was at Motorola, and that's when it made sense to me. It was like, oh, this is the game. Okay, now I see how it works.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
With that being said, how much responsibility is divided between you, the employee, and the company when it comes to growing your career?
It's 99% on you.
Okay.
And 1% on the company. I'm a firm belief that, yes, having a sponsor is great. Getting a sponsor is not easy. I'll be the first one to admit that. I was just blessed at that particular time in my career. But really, it's up to that individual. The individuals really they're the ones who have the control. And, oftentimes you hear people who come up with different excuses as to why their career is not progressing. But ultimately, it's that individual.
And the reason why I asked, because I recall several of my jobs back in the day, like you go in and day one of training or whatever, they would literally show you their corporate ladder. Mm-hmm. And I feel like I always struggled in corporate America because that corporate ladder was more so based off of your tenure there. Mm-hmm. And once you're there for 2 years, that's when you can go to account executive number 2. And I don't think it was really based off of, interest, work ethic, good scorecard, whatever the measurements were at that time. But it was like, well, you've only been here this X amount of time. You've only learned so much, where if I have the desire to learn and grow and be promoted and everything, in my opinion, is aligned, like, why not promote that person?
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. I always say that when you look at career progression, it's a slow boogie. Mm. And you have to be very, very patient. I was fortunate that I was able to make a couple of moves that expedited that process. And what I mean by that, those couple of moves is sometimes what people fail to realize is that when you change companies is how you advance your career quickly. If you really want to increase your compensation, changing companies is what does that. And so typically, when you look at most companies, if you look at your traditional merit increase, depending on the company, the industry, how well they're performing, your traditional merit increase is going to be somewhere between 2 to maybe 8%.
Right.
Then on top of the merit increase is the promotion, but the promotion may only happen 2, 3, 4 years. So, and then if you throw the promotion in, typically the promotion is going to be anywhere between 7 to 10%. Mm-hmm. So you take that 7 to 10% plus your merit increase, and chances are you're in the high end. So at max, every 3 to 4 years, you might be able to get a 15% increase internally. But if you want to really bump that up and start, increasing your salary by 20 to 30%, that's when you have to make a move from one company to the other.
Wow.
So it becomes a kind of a game. And so once again, I'm quick to say that part of my ascension was because of the moves that I made at certain times. And then fortunate enough, had some good bosses. I had some bad ones, mm-hmm. but I had some good bosses that helped out in that process too.
What are some best ways to make a career transition? I guess, well, let me back up. Transition, whether it's the same industry, but going to a competitor, or even a career transition, because I see a lot of people, they'll take extra classes, whether it's an MBA program or just certifications. They feel like they have to do that before they can make a career transition. Is that always the case?
That's kind of vague. It really depends on, the job function. It depends on the industry. So there's a lot of factors that can come into play as to career transitions. So let's break career transitions into two categories.
Okay.
One is from, let's just say you're an engineer in oil and gas, and you go from working at Chevron to working at BP. Okay, that's career transition. You're still doing the same job function. You're just doing it for a different company.
Right.
And either based on the need, based on you applied for a job, you were networking, you did something to stand out in your career, and you got recruited over there. The other career transition, the one that I think is the hardest thing to do, is when, let's say you're working in um, HR, and you want to transition into sales. So when you switch job functions and when the requirements become completely different, that's a very, very hard transition.
Okay.
Because as a recruiter, one of the things that I know is that any position that I'm recruiting for, they're looking for the needle in the haystack. Mm-hmm. They're not looking to hire someone that they can grow and they can teach. If you don't have the baseline of skills, I can't even submit that person as a candidate.
Gotcha.
And so, career transition as it relates to your job function and industry, easy. When you're trying to change job functions and industry, you go from, you're working sales in retail and now trying to get a job in oil and gas. That's a hard thing to do.
Gotcha. Okay, so I want to flip it a little bit onto the entrepreneurship side. You stated you were at, I guess, your first executive search firm, the company you were working for. Mm-hmm. What was it about that company, or I guess the job itself, the duties that were like, hey, I can do this on my
own? This was a firm that was created as a spinoff of Monster.com. So this is when the internet was just hot. So social media wasn't even around then. So I don't even think Facebook was around when this was taking place. So if you can think back to the early Monster career builder days in the early 2000s, a lot of firms were created. Monster.com went out and bought all these different firms and put them under one house. And what I realized is that, and there weren't too many people of color working at the partner level. And as I was beginning to work on these different projects, what I realized is that, well, this partner over here, he's no different than me. He may have a little bit more years of age, or, he may be older than I am, or she may be older than I am. But other than that, there's no difference. And what I began to learn is that really what was taking place is it's about how you present yourself, how you sell yourself. And that's what clients were buying. They weren't necessarily buying the company you were with. I mean, that was a part of it, but they were also buying that particular individual and what you brought to the table, and then what solutions you brought to the table. So that was the thing that I began to realize is that, whoa, this is something that I can do. And the more I was sitting on these different presentations, the more I was starting to do more sales, the success I was having with those sales and with those placements is what really kind of solidified, this is something that I want to do. This is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life.
I think lots of times when people branch out, it's like they think like, I know how to do my job and I can turn this into a business. Mm-hmm. What were some of the things you put in place as far as like the operational, the processes? Like, were you even cognizant of that? Because sometimes I feel like, hey, I'm a designer. Like I do graphic design. I can do logos. I want to get paid for doing logos. And we forget about the machine.
Exactly. Ooh, Lord Jesus. The infrastructure, the operational piece. The one thing I've learned is a couple of things is administrative support is huge, and then sales. Actually, marketing and sales. That has to be your steady mode of operation every day. What are you doing to market? What are you doing to close sales? If you aren't doing those two things in conjunction, it's going to be a struggle. And what I've come to realize is that that's the case for any business. Mm. And, before, people would separate. Marketing was one function and sales was a completely different function. I'm of the opinion, especially with social media, those two things go hand in hand. And so whether you're doing outbound marketing, outbound sales, inbound sales, those things go hand in hand. And really, that's the key to entrepreneurial success.
Do you think the personal brand only benefits the entrepreneur?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
Absolutely not, because your personal brand. What can someone do to enhance their personal brand? You can publish, you can speak, you can get involved with associations outside of work. So there are a lot of things that you can do to help with your brand. And I am of the mindset that you need to be able to brand yourself internally as well as externally. So those are two things that a lot of people make the mistake of only creating a brand or thinking of a brand in their company. Mm. And I'm of the mindset that when you're looking at yourself internally within your corporate infrastructure, you got to manage that brand up, you got to manage it down, and you got to manage it to the sides, because you never know how the power structure is going to change.
Yeah.
The person that you may be pissing off next to you next week, they're your new boss.
Yeah.
So you have to manage that brand carefully and strategically. Somebody told me, it's a fellow who wrote a couple of books. He was an HR leader, and one of the things he said is that you have to play politics.
Yeah.
And often, when people first hear that, they think that is a negative thing. But really, what he was saying is that when you're playing politics, it's about building relationships. You have to build those relationships with other departments. You have to build those relationships with your peers, with the people that you're managing and the people who are managing you. So being able to build those relationships effectively really becomes the key, one of those keys to success in building a personal brand.
Yeah, I know one of the things I liked about working at Invesco is that we had so many affinity groups, mm-hmm. as well as sports teams. Mm-hmm. And even though it was already a laid back environment, but just to know, like literally when I get off at 5:00, I'm going to go play kickball, and I have a chance to talk to, someone, a VP possibly in a different department, that if it wasn't for this kickball game, mm-hmm. I probably have no chance of coming across him on such an intimate level.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And once something as simple as playing in a kickball game can make a huge difference if you're out there building relationships, and it puts you in a situation where that you're not able to necessarily have when you're during your 8 to 5.
Right.
And I'm gonna make a plug real quick, Michelle. So you know that I love the game of golf. Mm-hmm. I think more people should pick up the game of golf and leverage that within their relationship building. And so me playing golf over the years has actually helped me in my career and helped me even in the business development aspects. So I know you're not a golfer. Mm-hmm. But I'm making that plug for everybody who's out here, who's checking out this podcast. Play the game of golf, and you play the game of golf. You don't cut deals on the golf course. You build relationships that will lead to cutting the deal. That's one of the reasons why they have something called the 19th hole.
Okay, let me get my stuff together. Mm-hmm. Go to putt and start practicing before I get to the real deal.
Whatever you got to do.
I do think though, within our community, networking has that negative connotation. Or it's like, I'm already at work for 8 hours a day. I really don't want to deal with y'all after 5 o'clock.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to play kickball. I'm not going to happy hour. I'm not going to this networking event after work, like nothing. And like, we can no longer just keep our head down in the cubicle and do good work, because yes, you do good work, but like, no one knows you. No one knows your personality. So I try to encourage, just people in general, not just my listeners. It's like, you got to get active within your company.
Absolutely. And whether that's an affinity group,
Mm-hmm.
that could be a variety of things. That could be a volunteer project. That could be going out to work for cocktails after work. There's a book called Never Eat Alone.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that book because he talked about how Farazi was his last name. But he talked about how he built his career through having breakfast meetings, lunch meetings, dinner meetings, cocktail meetings. He made his career a part of his social life.
Mm.
And so many people don't do that. You do your 8 to 5 and you come, go home or do whatever you do, but you got to find that mix between building those relationships, and you have all day that you can do that. So sometimes, hey, maybe the only thing you could do is have coffee at 7:30 in the morning. And if it's coffee for 30 minutes, at least you have the opportunity to build that relationship separate from what you do within your 8 to 5.
So a couple of years ago, you wrote a book, Inclusion Recruiting, the 12 Secrets to Recruiting a Diverse Workforce.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to go ahead and tell us about that book?
Yeah, that was, so I've been in this, in recruiting. So I've been in recruiting for over 25 years. And one of the things that I noticed is this perception about diversity recruiting. And to be quite honest with you, it really pissed me off. And that really was the reason that I decided to write the book, because I got tired of hearing people say that diversity recruiting was a form of reverse discrimination, or that somebody's being hired and they're not as qualified as someone else. And so because I'm in the recruiting game and I saw what was actually happening, that's when I came up with the idea of, calling it inclusion recruiting. And the idea was that, hey, building a diverse workforce, there are positives around that. But building a diverse workforce does not mean exclude white men. Actually, white men are critical to the process. And so inclusion recruiting was all about making sure that you build a diverse pipeline, you build diverse candidate slates. And then it was really about how do you go about doing that? And really just trying to stress the point, it's not about excluding anyone. It's about building diverse pipelines, diverse candidate slates of qualified candidates. And so by no stretch of the imagination do I believe put a weak candidate on a slate only because they're diverse, or because of their ethnicity, or because of their gender, or because of their disability. You have to work to build that slate. And oftentimes a lot of corporations don't do it. To be quite honest with you, they're lazy, because it's going to take more work to be able to do that.
I guess that's why I go back to a previous question, like, whose responsibility is it? Is it between the employer and the organization? Because if I'm a young Black woman, or even a guy, and we'll just say coming from Prairie View as an engineer, going into one of these organizations, it's like, yes, I get the entry level position, but then I'm struggling to figure out how I need to move up. And like you said, when you get to the partner level or the C-suite level, there's not many of us.
Mm-hmm.
And then a lot of us, we jump ship and we start our own business, right?
Right.
It's like, I guess trying to get a better understanding of where that balance is. And I feel like for me, especially with this podcast for the past 3 years, all the people I've spoken to, like if I met you just a little bit sooner while I was at Invesco and I had this information, I probably would have stayed much longer versus quitting, because I didn't know. I felt like when it came to business, it was all or nothing.
And that's not the case. And I once again, I used the word earlier, slow boogie.
Yeah.
Corporate America is a slow boogie. And you have rare exceptions of someone who gets promoted quickly and to different levels. That's not the norm. And especially if you take a big infrastructure like Chevron, that's a slow boogie. And actually, in some cases, the bigger the corporation, like a global corporation, that's going to be more of a slow boogie. And it's about patience. It's really about patience. Sometimes in Sheryl Sandberg, in her book, Lean In, which I think is a great book for a lot of people to read, she said that sometimes you have to take a lateral move before you can take an upward move. And so that's, but that, it takes time. It's not a fast process. So someone who's going to play the corporate game, you got to be willing to play the slow boogie. And you got to be willing to be patient. And in some cases, you can't look at yourself being at one particular company for a lifetime if you really want to leverage your career. So you may have to put in 5 years in one place, 3 in another, 5 here, maybe 10 here, because that's what you're going to have to do in order to really manage your career and maximize your earning potential in a shorter period of time.
Yeah. And times are changing, but I do feel like it was frowned upon a couple of years ago. Or you just have to have a really good reason as to why you were job hopping.
Well, so things have changed. But what I would also say is that if you're good, they'll hire you.
Okay.
So if someone is good, if they have the skill set, you're going to get hired. And you will have managers, 15 years ago saying, this person is moving around too much. Yeah, there was some of that, but you can't say that today. And the other thing is, I would tell managers, hey, when people leave, they usually leave because of somebody. Usually it's their hiring manager. So what are you doing to keep your people?
Right.
So different strokes for different folks, but yeah, once again, if you want to maximize your money, that's what's going to happen.
On your level as a headhunter, have you seen social media affect any of your clients, whether it's good or bad?
And when you say client, are you clients or candidates?
Actually, more so the candidates, but I'll be curious to hear.
Candidates for sure. Yes, a candidate there. I mean, there are several, cases or stories where a candidate gets a job offer. They go to check their social media profile, see something that doesn't look good, doesn't fit with their culture, and they rescind the offer. So when you talk about personal brand, you have to be very careful with the stuff that you're saying and that you're putting out there on social media. And so whether it's your Facebook account, whether it's your Instagram account, LinkedIn is pretty stale, but but you can get raunchy on Facebook and LinkedIn and Instagram. So yes, you most definitely you have to be aware.
Do you think that's fair?
It is what it is. It ain't fair. I tell people all the time, what's your favorite sport, Michelle?
My favorite sport?
Yeah.
Basketball.
So you have that court, you have the out of bounds lines, you have the 2 hoops on both ends, right? And, one basket is considered, a free throw is 1 point. If it's within the 3-point line, that's 2 points. Outside the 3-point line is 3 points, right? There's the quarters are defined. It's a game. If you don't recognize corporate America and your career as a game, it's going to be a struggle. So you can't go onto the basketball court trying to play football rules.
Okay.
So it's a game.
Yeah.
And I think oftentimes, within the African American community, sometimes we're expecting things to be fair, and it ain't fair. And so it's about how do you learn to adjust to the game that you're playing. And if you're willing to adjust to that game, you increase the chances for success. So when we talk about building a personal brand, when we talk about building relationships, when we talk about, getting mentors and that's part of the game. Those are just some of the rules. Those are some of the players within the game. And it's all about how do you manage that game. But I can tell you this, coming to work, working just 8 to 5, getting your 30-minute lunch, taking your 15-minute breaks, and out the door at 4:30, 5 o'clock ain't going to cut it. In most cases, it's not going to cut it. Should I drop the mic?
No, ain't finished yet.
Oh, okay.
So do you think companies should be more supportive when it comes to side hustles?
As long as it doesn't interfere with what you're doing, what your job is there. It's pretty straightforward. If you got a side hustle, but you're doing your side hustle during work hours and it's prohibiting you from getting done what you're supposed to be doing, that's a problem. But if you have a side hustle, but you're still able to get your work done, and maybe you're able to get your work done in 5 hours instead of 8 hours. The key is that you get your work done and you're performing what you're being paid to do. As long as you keep those two things separate, most companies are not going to try to interfere with your side hustle unless there's some type of conflict of interest with, your job. So you're in sales for a computer firm, but you're selling computer parts on the side.
Right.
Yeah. So as long as there's not any type of conflict like that, most companies don't care about your side hustle.
I disagree. I don't think everyone's as evolved as you are, because I've been on interviews where they've Googled me and they'll be like, "Oh, it looks like you got a lot going on." Like, what are you talking about? But I have my website, and of course everything's on my website. So I think that's hindered me in the past when it came to looking for jobs. And I'm like, did you call me in here to ask me that one question? Like,
yeah, and there are people they're hiring managers, recruiters, HR people who sometimes they make funky decisions. That would be my personal take. So if somebody came to me and asked me that question, and that would, if a hiring manager came to me and I was their HR manager or HR director, as long as it doesn't conflict, there's not a conflict of interest, and that it doesn't prohibit them from working, that's what they want to do. That's up to them. And I think that's becoming more and more common today than ever before. So 20 years ago, 30 years ago, might have been a little bit more tougher, but I think that's becoming more and more popular because an individual cannot put all of their faith into a company.
Right.
Because that company can cut you loose the next day if they make that decision to do that. And have no second thoughts about doing that. So, I don't know if my opinion is kind of evolved, but that would be my take. As long as there's no conflict and it doesn't, pose a problem with your job, then this shouldn't be a problem.
So I want you to give us some advice as well as an action item that listeners could, hit the ground running. They don't do anything else. They need to do this one thing.
In what aspect?
I have 50, like my listeners, they're both, right? A lot of them are corporate with the side hustle. And then I have another segment, it's nothing but entrepreneurs. But what would be the action item, I guess, to just grow your personal brand in either direction?
If you have the corporate thing going on and that's your thing, work and strive to become an expert at something, something that you can put your stamp on. And I think that's part of that's the first step in your personal brand is, what do you do? What are you an expert in? I think that would be the first thing. On the entrepreneurial tip, marketing and sales. I think it was, I heard Mark Cuban on an interview, and someone said, what's the key to success in a business? He says, always be selling. Mm-hmm. Always be selling. And I'm to take it a step further, I'm of the belief, always be marketing and selling. And so I'm in that. I'm trying to make that transition to be a consistent marketer and salesperson. And so although my expertise is in executive search and human resources, I have to master the art of building a successful sales pipeline and being a good salesperson.
That's a whole nother podcast.
It could be. But you said what? You said one thing.
No.
You said one thing. And I think that applies to whatever business you are in.
So how can listeners get in contact with you?
There's a couple of things. Always connect with me on LinkedIn. Darrell James, Darrell, James, James. My website, James and Jordan, JamesJordanLLC.com is my website. So those are probably the two best ways to connect with me.
All right, Mr. James, I do appreciate your time. And people, I believe in you. And a personal connection leads to an influential network. Thanks for networking with Michelle.